Good evening. We will call this Teaching and Learning Committee meeting to order on December 2nd at 5:21 p.m. Start with roll call. Tracy Pollock.
Here.
And Brian Medved.
Here.
Okay. Agenda revisions and approval.
Move to approve the agenda.
Second.
Tracy with the motion, and I have Brian with the second. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll take a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. And opposed? That motion carries. We'll move on to the meeting minutes, item 4.
Move to approve the November 4th, 2024 committee minutes.
Second.
I have a motion by Brian and a second by Tracy. Any discussion? Hearing none, take a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. Okay, item 5, we have reports and updates. First one is the Germantown report card update, and we have Jake Miziak.
Good evening. At the previous Teaching and Learning Committee, we had started a conversation around the state report card and some of the changes that were made statewide to the state report card. And this follow-up update is to put some context to what the changes to the state report card meant from Germantown, as well as kind of highlight the 4 key component areas of the Germantown state report card. So for every state report card, under this newest construction, what you see is you get an overall score, and our overall score for the 23-24 school year was a 75.9, which is an exceeds expectations score. And then you can see that we were allocated 4 stars to go along with that. School districts can receive 1 through 5 stars, with 5 being the highest amount of stars that you could receive. And then in addition to that, what you're going to see on every state report card, and it breaks it down at the school level as well as the district level, is these priority weights. So you can see how much of our state report card is comprised of each one of those areas. You can see that 37.6% of our state report card is based on our achievement, 12.4% is growth, and then we've got a balance of 25% for both target group outcomes and then on track to graduation. If you look at our previous state report cards, you can see in 21-22 we were at 77.3, and then we went up last year to a 78.1, and then this year we fell about 2 points down to a 75.9. You can see that across the 3 years here, there is some relative consistency in terms of how much those weighted areas are. There's not a significant difference there. The target group outcomes and on track to graduation are always going to remain the same as 25% of our state report card. The growth area is impacted by your number of students who are classified as economically disadvantaged. So as that number goes up, so does the growth component of your state report card. One of the things that happens when you get your state report card is you take a look around and you see how everybody else is doing too, so that you can put some relative context to your state report card. And this year we didn't necessarily have a great idea of what was going to happen, because we knew that there was going to be some changes for both the way that they changed the number of students who were in each one of the proficiency areas, as well as there were some changes to the actual state test. So we weren't exactly clear when we saw our results initially, when the results of Forward and ACT came in, what impact that would have on our state report card. So when you take a look around, as I mentioned before, we were rated as a 4-star district. So this is what that first column is the number of school districts in CESA 1 who had that rating, and I compared us to K-12 school districts. So if you're a 9-12, I didn't include their data in here, as well as some of the K-8 feeder districts. They're not in this data as well. So these would be the districts that are relatively comparable to us. So in the previous state report card, not last year's, but the one before that, there were 7 total school districts that were rated as 5 stars. So then when we looked at how well they did in the 23-24 state report card, only one of those school districts saw an increase in their overall score, where 6 of them saw their score fall. So only 14% of those school districts saw an increase in their state report card score. When you look at their actual difference between last year's score and this year's score, the average change was a drop of about 1.1 points. And then you can see that there's a larger proportion again of school districts that did not see an increase that were in that 4-star category. So there was 15 total school districts that were in that category in the 22-23 school year. 3 of those school districts saw an increase. 12 of them, like Germantown, saw a decrease. So only 20% of those school districts went up on their state report card with an average change of about 1.2 points. And then these 2 groups are a little bit smaller. So 3-star school districts, there was 8 of them. About 4 of them went up, 4 of them went down, resulting in 50% of them seeing an increase, with their net change a little less than or 0.3 points. And then finally, there were 2 school districts with a 2-star rating. Both of those school districts saw an increase in their state report card, and they saw an increase in their state report card of 3 points. So that gives you an idea of kind of how CISA 1 did on the state report card in terms of how their score may have been impacted by the changes that were made to the reporting this year. One of the biggest things that you're going to see on our state report card, and I'll highlight this in comparison to previous school districts, they intentionally left off all other school or years for comparison. So if you've looked at our previous state report cards, you normally see this picture, and there's 3 school years worth of data there, so that it gives you a nice comparison and trends of how well are we doing over time. You'll note that this year they put the caveat that the 23-24 school year cannot be compared to previous school years. So they're advocating for us not to take these 2 charts and then transpose them onto what we've seen for our 3-year trends and say, this is how well we're doing, because they're telling you there is not a comparison that you should be making in terms of achievement for this school year compared to the previous school years.
Jake, sorry, this is directly from DPI's website?
This is everybody's state report card. So if you go to or Google Wisconsin state report cards, you'll be taken to the main landing page, and then from there you can look at any school district's state report card. Obviously you can click on Germantown. Once you go to Germantown, this is our state report card. So this screenshot here is directly from our state report card, which we received from DPI.
So DPI is the one recommending do not compare this to others.
That's correct.
Um,
So on their end, they communicate with the CISAs. So I'm involved in a couple of groups, and then we also have a district assessment coordinator, our DAC, who's a part of a network. And they've given us frequent updates along the way. And the communication from DPI to the CISAs has been exactly the same thing as prepping our groups to say, don't make those comparisons, don't transpose this year's achievement data onto previous school years, because there should not be a comparison. You're taking 2 separate tests. The achievement bands or what qualifies as something like a advanced or meeting is different than what it has been before. And I can show you that a little bit more clearly when you look at what our historic achievement has been. So typically this is what you would have seen on a state report card. So you can see certain trends within our state report cards starting in 2021, whereas the number of students who were in English language arts has slowly increased in terms of the number of students who are advanced. You can see it's slowly increasing in terms of the number of students who are proficient. You can see similar trends in math, where the number of students who are advanced is increasing, our total number of students who are proficient are increasing. The top is our students who are performing in the below basic band, and you can see there, just like you would want to see, we're seeing a decrease over time, and then the same thing for mathematics. So those are trends when you look at previous years, suggest, the incremental improvements that we're doing are resulting in changes for our students.
So I just wanna, so if we're following at home or watching this later and we're looking at what you're discussing, is it safe to say the aqua and purple is where we'd like to see the biggest increases and we'd like to see decreasing in the yellow and orange?
Correct.
Okay.
But we can't do that, as Mr. Miziak said, based on this year's results, because it's not apples to apples.
Sure, I'm just trying to set context, just visually when I look at this and how I compare things internally in my head. The numbers we actually want to see are at the bottom of this. We want
Yeah.
to see those growing. So those are our top higher performers. And as we are able to elevate kids into the status, that's a general indication of
Improvement.
performing school environment, which is a well-performing student. Okay.
So I'm going to jump back those 2 slides. So just take a look at mathematics, for example. So this year in mathematics, we had 8% of our students who are in that lowest band. You can see we have 25.8% in our highest band. And if I click back to just last year, we were at 13.9 and 15.6. So you see some, a dramatic swing there, which is why DPI is recommending don't compare this to previous year, because we've changed the cut scores and the test changed. So part of that is them saying you can't necessarily say you're doing much better based on the fact that these things have changed. There were some variables in the equation that changed as well. It's always great to see the number of students that we saw who are now being identified as being in that advanced column or meeting the standards, so that's great news. But one of the things that becomes more difficult is if you were to say, well, we want to use this data for continuous improvement, or we want to monitor our overall performance over time. It becomes a little bit, DPI would recommend not to do that. It gives us, as I stated before, it's going to be a baseline year for us to say this is how many students were identified in the 23-24 school year as being proficient and advanced, and go from there.
So, sorry, go ahead. It's yours.
Well, just with the change with the cut score and the testing, I guess the concern would be that what kids or students are gonna fall through the cracks because now they seem like they're proficient and yet they're not, and what, do we have a
So
plan in
what
order
the-
to identify
so-
those?
So what DPI would say is the changes to the cut score and the test would be and part of their rationale to say this is, they said, well, part of this was we weren't necessarily assessing grade level standards to the degree that we should be. So the representation of questions on the test weren't adequate to
And when you say we, you don't mean
German.
Germantown School District, you mean we as the Department of Education?
Correct, the creators of the test.
Yeah.
So that test was not, in their opinion, adequately measuring grade level standards, so they increased the proportion of questions on that test that should be aligned to grade level standards and what the priority areas should be for that grade level. So it's to more accurately, in their opinion, measure student performance for that given year. The cut scores, the rationale for changing the cut scores was to bring it in closer alignment with other states, so that when states are reporting out on the number of students who are proficient and advanced, we are closer to what other states are saying proficient and advanced are. So, to your question, part of this data is we have to look at it in context with all the other data that we have. So we would look at map testing to make sure that we still are seeing the progress in our students, that they're still growing at the rates that we want them to grow, and that gives us an idea of whether or not a student is performing at the level that we would anticipate that they should be. So there is a story that you could say. I'm not saying that this story is true. Here's the story, that the test that we were giving to students before was too hard, so we weren't identifying enough of our students who were proficient or advanced. And that's why the cut scores had changed, that the cut scores at that time were too rigorous and was not identifying students in the way that we would have anticipated it should be. So they adjusted the cut scores.
DPI tells us not to compare them we're saying don't compare them, people in the community will still compare them.
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you that it's human nature. Even when they say
Yeah.
don't compare, you take a look at that and you're like, there are general conclusions that you'd want to draw and say, you know, we're seeing some positive improvement in math. We saw some growth in ELA. We see that number shrinking for the number of kids who are in that developing column. So you want to do that. I think one of the things that's important to remember is in a school system, this is one of the data points that we have. It's one of our most forward-facing. It's the one that our state report card's based on. It's the one where we get our report card score. So absolutely there is some value that we should hold for this score. We're going to talk later on the Act 20 side of things. The most powerful data that teachers are going to have is more of this real-time data that they can generate through some of the assessments that are built into the curriculums that we have. It's some of the assessments that we have in the diagnostic tools that we have to assess student gaps. Those are the things that we're really going to use to move students forward. So the most powerful assessments that we have that we can impact learning with and students with aren't necessarily here. But to that end, I absolutely, you know, it's, if you were a community member in Germantown, if you're a prospective home buyer and you wanted to look at how well certain school districts are doing and making sure that you're selecting a community that's growing kids and is a high achieving school district, absolutely the state report card is something that somebody might want to look at.
And because that doesn't just affect our district, are we, when you look at other districts that you're comparing us to, are they seeing similar bumps in achievement or decreases in the bottom end? How we want to look at that?
Yep. So one of the slides that I showed you previously was how everybody did across, and you saw that some of the, you know, the 4-star and 5-star schools, the vast majority of them saw a decrease in their overall score. You can also look at them and say they see similar trends in terms of what they saw here. So their number of students who are proficient or advanced or meeting in advanced now, they saw similar increases as well as seeing that lowest group of developing go down. So you can see similar trends across all of those state report cards, but that still resulted in net overall scores that fell for many of them.
Tom?
So go ahead.
Without having an overall trend line, and I understand no one has that because of this new data, but someone who just comes and looks at this slide says, well, we only have 65% that are advanced or meeting ELA. Well, that doesn't sound real good.
Yeah.
And I understand we put in a new program that should increase this, and
Right.
we'll probably talk about that next.
Yeah, so similarly, so if you take a look at previous school years, right, so track all the way back to 21 or 2021, at that point we're looking at about 50% of our kids who are proficient or advanced based on what the forward exam identified as proficient advanced. So absolutely, that's the, and that number, unless it's 100% of our students proficient in advanced, is never going to be the number that we want to see, because that's our end goal, right, is to continuously push that up. And to that end, having consistent viable curriculum at our K-8 level in ELA, and then the same thing, K-8 mathematics, that gives you a starting point for making sure that in each and every classroom, the standards that are being assessed on this are being taught to in the classrooms. But absolutely, the number is not going to be, again, it can't be high enough.
So can you help me reconcile, we're seeing an improvement in English and math. We understand some of the reason why. We think some of it's authentic improvement, others is based off of the changes that were made. That's improving, but our overall, and maybe you're going to get to this later, the overall reports card dropped.
So achievement is one of the areas of the pie. So there's the 100% of our state report card score. Achievement represents a little over 37% of that score. So even when you're seeing improvements in achievement, that may not result in a net gain on your state report card. In the state report card, there's some other data that can be useful to look at. So to Tom's point of taking a look at those numbers, and you might put it into context and it doesn't sound very good where you say, well, there's only 60% of the kids who are proficient or meeting grade level standards. If you take a look at the internal pieces of the state report card, what you can see is how we compare it to all the other school districts in the state of Wisconsin, and they'll tell you currently our achievement score is better than 88.4% of all the other school districts in the state of Wisconsin. So it again, can't be high enough, but it puts it into context relative to what everybody else is doing. One of the other things to note, and we had talked about this at the previous Teaching and Learning Committee, was when you take a look at achievement, so this is achievement last year, or the previous state report card, so not this year's state report card, the one before. You can see that we're just slightly below, so we were at 88, now we're at 89 here, so we dropped 1 percentage point. But one of the things to note is if you take a look at our ELA score, it's identical to what it was in previous years. You can see that our math score ticked up slightly. So ELA is identical, math is slightly higher.
Sure.
The reason for that, and there's a technical document that explains how achievement is calculated so that you can run the numbers yourself. We get, press the button. We get points for the last 3 school years. So for every achievement score, there's 3 years worth of data built into them. You get a different number of points for each one of the areas that your students are assessed. So there's the highest category ranging down to the bottom. You get 0 points for students who are in the lowest category, and you get 1.5 points for the highest. So you can see the total number of points that we're getting for our students who are advanced is consistently increasing. You can see the total number of points that we're getting for our kids who are proficient is increasing. And same thing here where the approaching is slightly going up too, because our developing students are going down. So then you can develop the point average for that year. So that's the total number of points divided by the students who took the test. So over the last 3 years, you can see that our point average trended up. So last year, the 23-24 point average we had was 0.85. There's some additional calculations that they do to essentially account for different numbers of students who are in those classes. So they weight them. So if you have a graduating bubble that has a lot more kids than some of the previous years, you have to weight that class because it has more kids in it. So that's what these 2 scores down here are. It's basically accounting for the variation in the number of students. And then what they do is they take your scores from the last 3 years divided by the weight, and that gives you your new ELA score. So our ELA score for this year, without any alteration done to it, was a 78.9. So that accounts for 2 previous years with our previous way of calculating achievement and this year's new cut scores. DPI, for the sake of being able to compare achievement across multiple years, used what was called a scaling system this year to try to keep your state report card similar to where all the other state report cards were.
This is the formula we talked about.
This is the formula.
last
So
meeting.
it's 0.97 of this score, so 97% of the score, minus 4.32 or 31. I've got it on the last slide. So essentially you can see how that impacted our score. So it took us from a 78.9 down to a 72.2. What DPI said was, since all these school districts saw improvements, so you saw your advance go up, you saw the number of students meeting go up, they didn't want to penalize us for that scale score, so they gave us our last year's score. So they scaled you down, and then if you dropped below where that was, they kicked you back up to your previous year. So when you look at our achievement score, there's a little bit of a slice taken off of us because of the fact that we couldn't see any of the positive impacts that any of the changes we made were there. Because we didn't see enough of a jump, even though it was 8 percentage points in our point average, it wasn't enough to get us out of what that scale score does. But the purpose, what DPI wanted, was our state report card overall score to be relatively comparable to previous ones.
What'd that do to a low achieving district?
So if you have your point average, you lose 0.97, right, of that score, or you retain 0.97 of that score. So the higher your score is, the more is cut off. So if it's a lower achievement score, it's a little bit less impacted than the higher achieving schools. So you saw that on the state report card where it kind of balances the
where
5
the
stars
2
versus the 2.
And why, so we're seeing that because of this, or why are we seeing that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Why are we seeing high achieving schools being impacted negatively from this adjustment and low achieving schools being impacted
That's a
positively
great
from this
question.
adjustment?
Why they set that formula, I haven't been given a rationale as to why they picked the formula that they used. But I can tell you that's the impact, because again, 0.97 of a higher score is gonna take more off.
I understand you can't tell us, but you can't tell us because they're not telling you.
Correct.
Or better yet, they're actually not telling CISA who's not telling you.
Correct. And there wasn't, again, the purpose that they've stated was to try and make your overall score comparable to previous years. So,
So are they
again,
trying to mitigate the cut score and test change?
they were trying to.
But then it over mitigates it, so now they're saying don't compare it?
They don't want you to compare it, period. So,
Even if this was a little more dialed in on a formatic base?
so the net result for them was to say, we want your state report card to not see this big jump. I would say, I can't remember, it must have been 8 years ago or so, they switched the test. They went from the WKCE to the Badger, and all school districts saw a similar phenomenon, and they didn't do anything. So there was the Badger year where a bunch of schools saw an enormous increase in their overall performance. So they didn't do anything to mitigate the fact that they switched exams. And then they switched from the Badger to the Forward, and then they saw a drop. And they didn't do anything there again. And then since they made that switch, we've been continuing on with the Forward exam. So because they made those changes, again, the only rationale that they've given for why they implemented these cut scores was to make this year's state report card similar to your previous state report card's scores. They don't want you to compare the two, but they want you to know that, your score is relatively similar to where it had been before. That was the point of that scaled score.
Based off of scaling that isn't individualized to each district, but applied blanketly across the state,
Correct.
over the widening
Same-
variety of all of the things that go into coming
Correct.
out with these scores based off of community makeups.
Correct. Same score for everybody, or same score adjustment for everybody.
Question on the 3-year achievement, we're measuring achievement based off strictly the test, and the test has not changed.
The test changed, so the Forward
The
exam.
cut score changed or the test changed?
Both.
Okay. So we're seeing improvement year over year based on a flawed scale because the test changed and the cut scores changed.
So
Correct.
that was only, right, so only for this year. So this year, we would see the cut score change and the test change go into our score. The previous 2 years, so the 21-22 school year and the 22-23 school year, you know, the improvement that you see from those 2 school years, that was using the same test, same calculations, everything.
So it appears, but we can't compare, that we're improving year over year.
Correct. If you, I mean,
But
if
we
you.
can't compare it to the last year.
Correct,
So we have a new scale we started at this year.
correct.
But even though it appears that we improved, our state report card number goes down.
Correct.
Yes.
That makes perfect sense.
Correct.
Yep, thank you for that, DPI.
And remember, achievement is just one portion of it, so it,
Yeah.
so that's, there are still two.
But it's the largest portion.
Correct, yep. And achievement, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is baked into some of the other scores that we have.
So, and before we get further down, piggybacking off that, obviously, we're worried about what our district's doing. But these people are making decisions on this that impact statewide, right? And communities are compared side by side, statewide. Community members of ours choosing to handpick numbers, or say this board is handpicking numbers to present. I'm asking that we have clear, and we are having an in-depth conversation, what goes around on this, affecting these scores. And Kim kinda hit it on the head. If this handicaps the high achieving districts, and we're seeing an overall drop, in the low achieving districts, a raise, could we take that as an authentic or unauthentic closing of the achievement gap? And I understand that's a very loaded question, but it's one that pops into my head when I see that, and I, as a citizen of the state,
So I can answer it from a classroom perspective. So as a classroom teacher, if, you know, I was presented with, you know, data from a pre-test in the very beginning of the year of how my students were doing in math, and, you know, there's a wide variance in terms of their performance, the achievement gap. You know, I've got a bunch of kids who aren't performing well, and I've got some that are achieving really high. So I've got a pretty wide achievement gap in my classroom. If I brought that data at the end of the year back to you, and essentially what I did was I reduced the number of students who are performing really well. The gap between my lowest performers and my highest performers would have been reduced. But I would argue that's not a way in which we would want to
It would seem
decrease
bad.
the
It'd be a bad approach.
achievement gap. Essentially, our data is what you'd want for closing an achievement gap, which you can see over the 3-year trends that we had prior, right? So what we want to do is we want this bottom number here to continually go down. So that's not, it's not just about us increasing these 2 top numbers, as you pointed out before. It's also about how we were impacting that first line too. So it's that comparison, right? We want to consistently increase the number of students who are meeting and proficient or meeting in advanced, and we also want to make sure that we're decreasing the number of students who are in that lowest band.
Theoretically, that would correspond, that would flow, right?
Yep, so that's the,
Unless you had a huge influx of students or decrease in students.
correct.
Growth?
So in the state report card, this is the smallest wedge of our pie. So growth is a little bit trickier to explain. There is a technical document that DPI has on there, but you don't have all the data sets that they use to generate your growth score. So first what I'll tell you is that our growth score for 23-24, we were better than 89.7% of the school districts in the state of Wisconsin. How growth is measured for students, they take last year's assessment score, and then they take this year's assessment score, and what they're doing is they're comparing like students. So you're not being compared to yourself. So it's not the growth that you individually made that is contributing to the growth score, it's the growth that you made relative to other students that are similar to you. So they take other demographic information into account when they do this. So students with IEPs, students from that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And they take that demographic data and then they use that to compare how much a student from those like variables grows and how much you grew relative to them. So if a student similar grows 3 points in a year, and then my score was 4 points, I would get a higher growth score because I exceeded what that group of students looked like. So the typical growth should have been 3, and I got to 4. In the previous year, you can see what our growth was. We were outperforming 95% of school districts in the state of Wisconsin. Again, we fell to that 89th percentile for this year. Again, one of the things that changes is it's comparing 2 different tests. So from this year to last year, there were 2 different tests that were being used to measure the students who were in those different groups. So this is not as straight a comparison as it has been in previous school years.
Question?
Yep.
On the growth part of it, we're making a comparison year over year, and that could be a healthy comparison. But you could also make the case, I believe, that you had a lot of learning loss due to COVID. And we may have had less learning loss than COVID, so our jump in growth may not have been as big as some districts that had huge declines in.
Correct. So one of the other things to pay attention, so this is one of those other variables on a state report card. There's multiple years for every one of the scores. So growth, just like achievement, has 3 years that are baked into it. And similar to that scoring, you get kind of a weight for each one of those years. The last year is weighted heaviest, and then it regresses for each year prior. So another thing that impacts your state report card is what years you're dropping off. So for growth, last year's state report card was the first one that was kind of outside of that COVID window where we didn't have that missing year because the state didn't administer the forward exam during the 2019-2020 school year. So that's another one of those factors is what years are you dropping off as you're looking at your new scores.
So, in conclusion, we have nothing to compare to, so we don't know how we're doing versus years previous. This is a benchmark for going forward, so we can maybe compare going forward, but the way they conflate the data every year, we may never know. In the last 10 years, they've changed the test 3 times, so we can't go back 10 years. There's a lot of factors that go into this that they change every year, the percentages, the growth, everything. This isn't telling us anything. That was the case I was making.
So it's a benchmark.
Yeah, it's been.
It's a bad
there's-
benchmark,
There's
though.
public ridicule in multiple districts, and even the governor's spoken out against DPI's decision to lower the bar for all students in the state.
I would make the case to Wisconsin residents, if we want to fix this, we need to fix DPI.
There's more that goes into this, obviously. You had this, I don't know if you showed it here, it's in the packet, the growth modeling. I just think it's a good visual to help people understand this. So how growth and cohorts work, right? That's what we're looking at here.
Correct.
I don't know if you just wanna run through that quick.
Yeah, so that's essentially what I was talking about before. So when we talk about growth, when I talk about map growth, that's comparing the same student to the same student. So it's how much did that student grow. There is a RIT score that's associated with students on MAP, so it tells you what average growth would look like for that student. So a student who is performing in the 50th percentile how much would we anticipate they would grow in a year. So that gives us a way to take how much a individual student has grown in a year and compare that to that same cohort of 50% kids. That's close to what this is, except it's not looking at that individual student's growth. It's the how well did they perform this year, how well did they perform last year, and then comparing that growth to the growth that's made for students of similar demographic background.
Whether they're outpacing or underpacing.
Correct. So it gives you, the way that DPI describes it is value add. So if what you're seeing is students who in those demographic groups are growing faster than the average, and they set the average to 3, then you have a value add for that particular group of students. Within the state report card, I didn't include this because it does not translate well onto a slide. But within the state report card, this is not gonna show up well at home either. On the growth page, what you're gonna see is it's a T-chart, and essentially what you want is what we have here, where our numbers are all to the right of that line, showing that for all those demographic groups, our groups are growing faster than that rate that we were looking for. So it breaks down all of them, so you've got.
Yeah, so if we're drilling down into the data beyond the
Correct.
simple line graph, we're seeing improvement. And I understand to the point of the bad apples and oranges data that we're kind of working with. But comparing this current data set out to other districts, which is what'll happen, we are in the positive side of that comparison.
Well, I think that's where we have to look, because at the report card level, I think, Jake, you'd mentioned it, the target group outcomes and on track to graduation is 25% for every district. But the achievement and growth percentages vary depending, because I think you mentioned the students with IEPs and those other demographics come into play. That's what I think. That's part of why when I look at the top line numbers, we scored 75.9. Our priority area weights 37.6 to achievement, 12.4 to growth. But when I look at another school district that in this particular case, they actually happen to score lower than us, but their priority weights basically are 25% across the board. I can't wrap my head around the fact, like, how can I truly compare our score to their score, because the weighting is different. So I look at what I paid most attention to, rightly or wrongly, was the details. Where I'd go to the achievement page, we got a 75.9. Our district score was the same or higher than 88.4% of districts in the state. That's good. There's room for improvement. I look at the other stuff, we're whatever. In some cases, we're in the 60s. Plenty of room for improvement. But when I look at these top line scores, I can't wrap my head around it, because our weighting is different than just about probably every other district out there. So, in some of these cases, I think they're trying to minimize the impact, once again, minimizing this impact, because you can't control demographics. You can control what's happening in the classroom, but if we have a larger student population with IEPs or other situations versus another district, we can't control that. We can't help that situation. So I think that's why these percentages are different. But that's the part that
we're seeing that
I care about what Jake had mentioned, where everybody's growing better than average or compared to others, or what, exactly. Like, that's important.
Yeah, I think it's so then you have to walk away from those districts that are just uncomparable to us in regards of demographic, and then you have to take demographically similar districts. But even when I do that, the top line numbers don't correlate well with each other, and not because it's a plus or minus. They're different scores for different reasons. So then when you go into that tertiary secondary and tertiary numbers, which is really what you have to do. You cannot, given the complexity of the conversation we're having, you cannot just use these surface numbers. And when you start looking at those, the secondary and tertiary numbers, we're seeing we're on the right side of things. Not we're amazing at everything, but we are a trend line, as you compare those, really in the right direction to where we're looking to go and continue to improve. It's just interesting our overall number drops, but we're actually seeing a lot of this, the secondary and tertiary numbers are really favorable. I know we stopped and got sidetracked here. You were on growth, and now we have target group outcomes.
Target group outcomes. Again, target group outcomes represents 25% of the state report card. Target group outcomes was a category that had changed in the 2021 state report card. It used to be represented on the state report card as it was called closing gaps. So the closing gap score used to be based on a particular demographic or demographic information, and they switched that to say what we're going to look at is the students who would represent your school district's lowest quartile. So the bottom 25% of your school district creates your target group. So it does not matter any kind of demographic information at all. It's strictly the lowest 25% of your school district. And what they do is they look at how well does that cohort of kids perform. And then they create essentially a mini state report card for that group. So they take a look at attendance information, growth information, achievement information, graduation information, and that creates your target group outcomes score. The weighting of the individual areas is a little bit different. So for the achievement bucket, for the target group outcomes, that represents 20% of that score. So 20% of it's based on achievement. So again, what you're going to see for our target group in 2022-23 versus 23-24, we remain the same. For ELA, that same, they don't negatively impact your achievement score. Again, our mathematics score was much higher this year, so we outpaced what that scale score was. So you can see that mathematics went up. When you take a look at 22-23 and 23-24 in terms of chronic absenteeism, here we do have a higher rate of chronic absenteeism compared to our last state report card. So you can see that number went down slightly, but they're very similar. And then in terms of our graduation rate, you can see that one slightly ticked up. Chronic absenteeism is represented by 15% of the state report card, or this particular portion of the state report card target group outcomes, and graduation rate is 15% as well. The largest proportion of the target group outcomes comes from growth. So how well did that particular cohort grow? I don't know why I didn't snap that on here. But I can tell you what our target group numbers were for ELA and mathematics for last year. We were at 62.2 and 66 for math.
66 for math?
Correct. The final piece of the pie for the state report card is a category called On Track to Graduation. So here you're looking at the 4 component scores for On Track to Graduation. Chronic absenteeism and graduation each get 40% of this category total. 3rd grade language arts proficiency gets 10% of the score, and 8th grade mathematics gets 10% of the score. I apologize that I'm going to flip back and forth. There's not a real clean way to do this. But you can see for chronic absenteeism, as I said before, we're slightly down from where we were last year. Last year's score was 87. This year it's 86. For graduation, again, we're up a 1/10 of a point. Our third grade ELA score is up from last year, 4 points, and then our 8th grade mathematics score is up 5 points. So those two pieces of the on-track graduation, even though they're the smallest components, we both saw increases there. So some of the big things to remember in terms of our state report card, the new cut scores and the test changes did result in significant increases for students who are identified as proficient and advanced on state testing. That was, again, a trend that most school districts saw across the state of Wisconsin. As noted on the state report card, achievement from the 23-24 school year cannot be compared to previous years. The changes that were made in the 23-24 components of the test impact multiple pieces of the state report card. So you saw how achievement does show up in multiple areas of the state report card. So those individual component scores, the year-to-year comparison, unless you're drilling down into some of the smaller components, you really shouldn't do like a trend line on those as well. And then the last piece of that is I put that scale score formula that was there. But the Department of Public Instruction used the scale score for our achievement data, and that reduced our overall achievement because of that use of that scale score. Any final questions that you have?
A dangerous question.
It is.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I've a couple of questions and maybe an ask for our district. So I took a look at roughly a dozen districts. Some, and the logic behind the ones I selected were proximity to us. Other districts that I knew would actually knew that they scored higher than us, plus also a few that either I have relatives or friends where they live. And I noticed, and I think part of this, having this discussion today and talking about the percentage and the weighting and some of these other things may have helped to a certain degree, but generally speaking, by far the majority of the districts that I looked at the individual schools' scores, honestly, I added them up, averaged them out, and then I looked at their district report cards. And the majority of them were actually pretty close. Now, I don't know if that's just pure chance or if that's kind of how it's supposed to work. But I found a couple out there where, actually, I'll use one of each. One school district scored 79.4, but I did their average of all their school districts, and they scored a 71.1. They had 10 schools in the district, only 2 scored higher than their district report card. On the other hand, I found another district that scored 77.5, they have 8 schools in their district, added those up, found that their average score was 83.5, and they actually only had 1 school that scored below their district report card score. Do the weightings have something to do, like why? I'll give you, just in the interest of transparency, we're 75.9. Once again, adding up our schools, we got a 79.8 for a difference of a minus 3.9 on our district report card. So these other ones, one was graded or got a score 8.3 higher. The other one scored -6. Why is there such variance between some of these districts? Like I said, the majority of them were 0.1 or 2 above, like I said, pretty darn close, where it could be theoretically a mathematical equation that caused that. But any reasoning behind why, in some cases, outside of our own district, there's these huge discrepancies? And there might not be an answer right now.
I don't have an answer.
Okay.
I just wonder what the overall impact of Wisconsin, how Wisconsin looks compared to how it did in years past. Like, was the goal to make it look like Wisconsin their school system is doing better than what it is? you know,
There's plenty of articles in the Journal and other publications in the state that DPI followed a national trend of lowering the cut score. So when Tony Evers was state superintendent, he followed a national trend of raising the bar and used NAEP, which is another type of standardized test that finds the norm comparative across the country. During his time as state superintendent, he raised the cut scores, and now our current administration has lowered to follow a national trend of lowering the expectation, to your point, to show growth this way versus this kind of growth where we're closing a true achievement gap. That's my opinion on that.
Well, and it's a disservice to kids, to all the
Yeah,
students.
I think
We
it gets to your point, right?
Right,
What kids are falling between the cracks now, because they look like they're doing better because this data flip occurred, and what are we doing to ensure that they don't? Because that's, I mean, I want to know all the totality of the data, and I want to be able to compare it across the state and to other like schools, but in the end, the thing we care about is where our kids end up, that come out of our schools and are in our schools. So how are we taking this? And I think you alluded to it earlier, this is a part
Yeah,
of that assessment process.
I don't know that there's a teacher in Germantown who would say, based on the forward scores, here's how I altered instruction for my students. So that, I mean, that's the residual effect of this, because you don't. The things that we've been working on on PD for the last 2 years and continue to work on is better understanding our standards so that we understand what those expectations are, so that we maintain high expectations. That bar has not changed for us. So regardless of what the forward exam says, you take any one of our state standards and you can decompose it into what the expectations are that we have for our students, and holding those expectations to the rigorous level of those grade level expectations is what's going to raise the expectations. So when there's a kid who's not performing well, then we respond to them in the classroom and we adjust our instruction to raise them up, and we'll hear about a little of that in the Act 20 piece that's coming up. But that's the idea, is that the most valuable data that we have for instructional purposes comes from classroom assessments, comes from some of the other diagnostic tools that we use within our district. That the forward exam, although it's something that can be used for that forward-facing piece to see how well our school district is doing compared to others, when it comes to kids and trying to impact kids, it's the smaller scale assessments that we use on a daily basis that are really going to move kids forward.
so my one question, I guess, would be, so moving forward for next year, because as we're talking, this is a benchmark. We can't do anything about what the state has done. We just have to figure out how we use it to the best of our district's, ability. So as far as moving forward, is there still gonna, once the test scores and everything come out, is there anything weighted anymore, or is that just that first year? So from now on, it's just whatever the scores are?
Yeah, they
that's
haven't
what it is?
said anything about scaling scores for next year. So the way in which they've talked about this scale conversion is a one-time adjustment that's going to be made. So
We
there has
could
not-
have new leadership at DPI that changes everything. Again, there's a spring election.
Well,
so
and that's the issue.
it's the
like-
constant moving goalposts,
Mhm.
right?
So we have to look, because they've even muddied how you compare district to district. As far as, everything that what you look at into comparing the different districts and how many schools in the district, and you're still like, it's just, nothing makes sense. So, to your point, it's how are our kids doing in our classrooms? How are they, are they progressing? And we can't, again, do much about what the state has done to our ability to even remotely compare. And so moving forward, we just look at the work that we've done in curriculum and keep moving forward and doing the testing that we can do and identifying the students that are having issues. And it's hard too, because it's a disservice to the students that were, highly proficient, because they've earned that also. Now you've taken that away from them also. So another piece that's a little bit unfortunate that you kinda don't look at also. Those kids that test was hard and they did well, we take that from them too, and that's not right. But, is that what can we do?
Let me conclude
Yeah.
with the whole premise of this, measuring the academics. We're using a testing system that is completely flawed. And there are books written on the problems with standardized testing. And everyone's welcome to go to the library and find all the different books that talk about the damage we're doing to kids with standardized testing, but I won't even get into that. Obviously, if you're creating a test that is meant to measure academics at a grade level, why does that test have to change every 3 or 4 years? That makes no sense. Why do you have to change the cut scores? Why do you have to change anything? If that's an accurate measure, why aren't we using it? And I do believe that there is a test out there that exists that potentially could do that, but we don't have it right now. So all of this is flawed data. I think spending this much time on a state report card that is completely useless is a waste of everyone's time.
I think the importance of it is just so that when people look from last year to this year, that we've had at least done
But they told us we
work.
can't.
Well, what we're saying is that at least now we've addressed that you can't, so that somebody comes and looks at it and says, well, oof, they're doing poorly compared to last year, we can say, no, this is new, because otherwise.
What
n- not-
percentage of home buyers moving into Germantown are gonna listen to this meeting? And listen to what we know about the DPI and the state report card and all the flaws that are built into it?
To your point, very few, but at least we have to, in our due diligence, at least just bring it to
Yeah.
light.
Oh, I agree.
I
think we've
the
done that
fact
well.
is I moved to this district, well, long
Because of
time ago.
recommendations of other people.
No,
Talk
but
to the
we
parents,
also
talk to
did.
the students.
That's partially true, but we also considered price, close to relatives, what we wanted in the
Commute.
school district. So we might be the outlier, but we looked at some of this stuff. And actually, I'm gonna pause here because I do have a suggestion or an ask for everybody, or at least the administration going forward. Because I do think here's the thing, we don't know what people look at. They may look at this report card, they may look at niche.com, they may look at some random site, they will talk to their friends or whatever the case might be. But we can't assume, well, they don't look or they won't understand the report card. We need to actually look at this and go, okay, what are some things that we can control that might help us out? And that's gonna be my suggestion, but that's the reality of it. They're gonna look, I pointed out a flaw at the top line score. The weightings are different, so you can't really truly do an apples to apples comparison unless you go a little bit deeper. And some of the deeper stuff, though I agree with you with some of the standardized test things that you've mentioned, that's to me the important piece. It's seeing the teacher and going, well, our kids are doing better compared to others, or whatever, those details behind all of this, I think is still important, even if flawed, because it's flawed for everybody. So we're not all on common ground, but we're all on flawed common ground to some degree, if that makes any sense. And so
Not a
there
good
will
place
be
to be.
people who go, this is how much I have to spend in a house. I'm going to have kids. I'm going to compare. I've done my research and I can afford to buy a house in Menominee Falls and Germantown. But we're going to have kids. I want my kids to go to a good school district. So what are they going to do? They're going to go to these various resources and look at this stuff. And I don't know what Menominee Falls report card scores off the top of my head, but if we're better than them, that might make the difference. I mean, from that perspective. So there's some value here, but it's not as easy as that top line score versus the other top line score, and that's it. Because like I said, we're in some areas where we beat, or at least are equal to 88 or whatever % of other school districts in the state of Wisconsin. I mean,
Yeah. I understand the frustration with the flawed. If we were at our last meeting, you would have seen the frustration with the flaws and the cut scores and the changing of the test. It's very evident. It's not, even if it is flawed, it's more of a reason to have this conversation, to flush this information out. And I get Not everyone in the world's gonna listen to it, but there are people that do listen to it. And there are people out in this community that are drawing inaccurate conclusions because they don't understand the totality of it, or are accusing this board of not having that discussion, or cherry picking information. And I asked Jake to flush this information out so we have that conversation in totality. So to me, there very much so is a reason to have this and a purpose to have this conversation. To not have the conversation, then why are we here? That would be my ultimate frustration. If we just
I guess
don't
my,
have
my
that.
frustration, I mean, I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, this is not a bad discussion, this is a great discussion.
Yeah.
But I've been beating my head against the wall for a dozen years now. And, you know, this is all old news to me. It's, you know, I hope people are waking up. I don't see
Yeah,
it.
I think we're
It's been
seeing a
long time.
reiteration of the changes that you've dealt with over those 12 years, right?
Exactly.
It's a new change to the same wheel, right?
Yeah, that's not helping.
Yeah.
I'll end there.
So, based off all of this, here's my ask. So as I was going through and gathering my information to do the comparison and take a look at other districts and everything else, I got to our page 9, and I may not have said, what the heck is this? But something similar to that, that I would do in private. So, and this isn't included in the scores, but this stood out to me so much, and so this is my ask. For the participation by type of post-secondary preparation, which includes advanced courses, dual enrollment, industry-recognized credentials, and work-based learning, can we please report that information? Because right now, I do have I pulled up Menominee Falls. Advanced courses, district percent is 27%. 337 students successfully completed at least one advanced placement course. Ours shows 12 students, 0.9%. Compared to the state of 21.1, we look horrible. Why are we know that's not true. Same thing with dual enrollment, we have 0%. I have to imagine we have a couple. Menominee Falls has 141. Industry recognized credentials, we're at 0. Menominee Falls, 238 students. Work-based learning, they're at 498, we're at 76. Like, our numbers may not necessarily be better than this district that I'm using as comparison, but I know they're better than 0.9%, 0, 0, and 6. So that's the kind of stuff that could make a difference if I'm comparing two neighboring communities and going, I can afford a house here. Okay, their scores are really similar, but boy, they don't seem to offer these opportunities that my kid's not book smart. He or she wants, to do some of these other, they want work-based learning or what, they want these other opportunities. On the surface, we don't offer any of that stuff, or people aren't taking advantage of any of that stuff. To me, it's not reported, it's not part of the score, but it's an important metric that we need to share because we know, and I think this community definitely knows, we do better than what these numbers represent. So that would be my ask going forward, is that we take a look at reporting those numbers so that these scores in particular actually reflect this district.
The scores in those areas are on a year lag, so it's for the 22-23 school year. That's, again, not accurate. The error occurred, there was a course change issue that happened, so how our courses were identified within kind of the setup within Skyward, our student information system, wasn't correct. So we've corrected those. So the newest snapshot is going to capture the 300 some plus advanced courses that we offer and
Dual
dual
enrollment,
enrollment.
and
and-
credentials, and work-based
See?
experiences.
There we go.
That was easy.
Anything else?
Alright.
Thanks for putting in the work.
Yeah, he fixed the glitch.
Yeah,
Alright.
okay.
Well, that's good news.
No, but that's important stuff. I mean, it is. When it's not being reported, in my time on the board, I've seen enough of that. And I think Chris can echo that. His time in the district, and same with you, Jake. There's little things that weren't being done quite right that actually we are doing and we're not getting credit for, right, as a district, or we're not getting credit accurately for. And that's the low-hanging fruit stuff, right? It's always, the first 30% of the job is probably the easiest to figure out, and the last 5% is probably the hardest to achieve. I feel like that's a 30%er
Yeah.
in that context, but I think we keep plugging away at those things. But yeah, building the understanding out is the key to it. And that's why it's happening in committee. That's why this isn't a full board discussion. This doesn't need to be a full board discussion, but most of the board is here, and I can guarantee the one that's not here watches things in replay to stay abreast of what's happening. So we'll continue to have those conversations. At some point, there's an ask this district has to make of the state, or multiple districts around the state have to ask of the state and DPI, and that's consistency. And the first thing that's gonna happen when they look to build that consistency, guess what it's gonna be? Another year of change, and another year where we can't, until we're on the right course. And unfortunately, that leadership is gonna be a revolving door for that position. My ask has always been internally, what are we building? So we can know our numbers internally accurate and use them year to year to weight in, to your point, what is our kiddo doing in the classroom from year to year? How are they, and how are we ensuring they're not falling behind or in the crack, or whatever analogy we want to use for that.
Yep.
That's
That'll be
what
part of the
matters the
strategic
most.
plan, right?
Well-
How do we measure?
I need to have kudos to you guys, because we're probably the only school board in the state that is getting this discussion and this kind of information off the report card. No one else is having this discussion. No one else is going through the report card and going through the data like you presented today. So kudos to you guys. I mean, really, this is good information.
Any more questions? Okay, well, let's, thank you very much for putting this together and all of the conversation on it. Obviously, we're very concerned with how this impacts our district, and I just appreciate all the questions and comments and putting this together so we can get that out. But we will move on to item B, and that is an Act 20 update. Back to you, Jake.
Act 20, we've talked about this a little bit. So one of the things that I wanted to update the Teaching and Learning Committee on are some of the things that are going to start taking hold in the district, and how Act 20 is going to impact us. So last year, we were most aware of Act 20 in terms of its requirement to have reading instruction that was aligned to some core components, and we wanted to make sure that in our K-3 classrooms, and essentially we did at K-8, that we had solid curriculum that our teachers were using with students to make sure that our students developed the necessary literacy skills that they needed. So to do that, we brought Wonders in. In addition to that, our teachers are starting in on one of their components, which is prior to July 1st of 2025, they all need to start a literacy training. There are a number of literacy training options that we could choose. There was one that was available to us called Cox Campus. I had mentioned this in a previous Teaching and Learning Committee. That was one of the free options, and it gives us an ability to manipulate the modules that are in it so that we can pace it out how we want to with our teachers. So they've already been exposed to elements of Cox Campus, but the actual completion of the modules, that's going to start in February. So we highlighted a couple of the key components that we wanted to make sure teachers had on the front end, but we're going to actually start digging into Cox Campus in February. In terms of the testing that our students are going to receive, all kids 4K through 3rd grade are required to take a screening assessment that's called Ames Web. In the fall, our kindergarten through 3rd grade students did not have to take the Ames Web screener. We decided to make sure that all of our students had it, so we kind of had a baseline of where they were going so that we could track their progress throughout the year. So even though it was not required of us to administer that screener to our students, we did administer. In the winter, we're going to go through the second administration of it, and that would be the first one that is required by Act 20. So in December, there's gonna be a letter that's going out to families to tell them more about Act 20 and the assessments that their students are going to be taking. It's really in January where our kindergarten through third grade kiddos will engage in that first round of testing. If students in that screening fall below the 25th percentile, so all kids who are 24th and below on that nationally normed screener, so to Kim's point of the how do we make sure kids don't fall through the cracks, MAP and AIMS are both nationally normed assessments, so that's one way that we're going to make sure that all of our students are performing at the level that we need them to. If the students are below that 24th or the 25th percentile, 24 below, they then take a second round of testing. It's a diagnostic assessment. The diagnostic assessment that we brought on board is called MAP Reading Fluency. So it's a pretty cool little assessment. The kid puts on some headphones. They've got a little thing that they read into, and the computer is able to measure their level of fluency and give some diagnostic information to both the teacher and the reading specialist. That is one of the approved diagnostic screeners that the state has, so it's the next layer that we're required to have, but it's also following the guidelines that we were given. After they complete the diagnostic assessment, it's at that point that we're required to, for all of those students who are below the 25th percentile, create a personalized reading plan. So parents are going to start to see this. There's a timeline that's enacted for each one of these components. So we're essentially staggering this so that the workflow works in each one of our buildings. We have a window of time that we're allowed to test students. So we'll do our K1 kiddos in the first 2 weeks of January, and then our 2-3 kiddos in the following 2 weeks of January, which creates like a staggered timeline of when parents will see that information coming home. Part of that is just for our reading specialists and principals to make sure that they are working with a manageable set of students at each one of those checkpoints. After they take that diagnostic assessment, they have a 10-day window in which they need to notify parents and then send home a personalized reading plan to the parents. So it's a pretty quick turnaround between when we have that diagnostic information and when we're sending information home to parents. And that 10-day window is 10 calendar days, not 10 school days, so it's a tight timeline. Into the teaching and learning packet, I provided you with a copy of what the personalized reading plan looks like, as well as the cover letter that parents are going to receive. So within that personalized reading plan, there are required sections per Act 20. So again, what we've created just meets all of the requirements for Act 20. So the first section is basically information about the child. The second piece of that is the team information who's putting the personalized reading plan together. So that's going to include our reading specialists in our building. If the student has an IEP, the special education teacher would be involved. If the student is an English language learner, we would have one of our EL teachers on board. Principals would be on that team, and a classroom teacher would be on that team in helping shape this plan. The second section of that, or the third section on this, is just talking about the universal curriculum that they're receiving. So per Act 20, students have to have access to a universal curriculum that meets all the requirements of Act 20. Ours does. So it's basically checking the box that they're participating in Wonders. The fourth section, I apologize, is the early literacy assessment data. So what parents will have is the progress of their students over time on how they did on each one of these assessments. And then you start to get into the meat of what the diagnostics are telling us. In the packet, I apologize, each one of those kind of like highlighted areas are actual drop downs that we created within the form, so that when you click on it, it'll tell you which area of reading we're focusing in on with the student. So there are little drop downs to make that process slightly easier for those teams, because they'll have options of what they're going to target. As you go deeper into the plan in Section 6, that's called the Child-Centered Implementation Plan. So what we have to do is we have to set a goal for the student's progress. So we identify where we want the student to be at intervals of time, and then we monitor that progress over time. So Act 20 requires us to monitor the students on a weekly basis for 10 weeks, and then after 10 weeks report that progress out to parents. So parents all along the way are going to receive progress reports on how well their student is doing, as well as whether or not they're making progress towards the goal that they've identified. After 10 weeks, and this isn't as strict as other plans in the education world, like an IEP. The reading plans can be a little bit more fluid, so if after 5 weeks we're noticing this isn't going the way that we want, we can make adjustments to that plan and then communicate it with the family that, you know, here's the progress monitoring data that we're seeing. We need to ramp up the intensity because the student's not making the progress we're looking for. Or subsequently, we're seeing some pretty great gains, and we can again communicate that home and make sure that they're aware of any adjustments that we might want to make. So we might want to dial down the intensity of the plan for students.
So I just have, I guess, one comment question. So it's the 25th, bottom 25th percentile. Why that? Because you could potentially have a class that is really, you know, does well in reading, and that bottom 25%, I understand you would take that test and they would be ruled out not needing this program. The bigger concern is if you have a class that in and of themselves struggle with reading. Now that bottom 25%, that is all that you're testing potentially, and the ones that still aren't doing well, they may not be the bottom 25%, but we're missing those kids.
So
Why
this
not
is
just the score?
Yep, so it's nationally normed, so that's the 25% that we're doing.
Mhm.
So this isn't, we've already done this, so this classroom does not exist in Germantown. If every kid in that class scored below the 25th percentile on that, one, we would say it's a universal curriculum problem, like we've got to do something different because that's why
Right.
this many kids are there. But the second piece of that is every kid would be required to have a personalized reading plan at that point.
Mhm.
So anytime a student falls below that 25th percentile, regardless of how many kids are in the class, they would get that personalized reading plan.
Okay.
If that proportion starts to tick higher than what we would anticipate, then we're pointing the arrow in the wrong direction. We're not saying we're not pointing at the kid and saying they need a particular plan. It's what are we doing universally for all of our kids that isn't going well, that we have this number of kids who are requiring a specialized plan.
So we came up with this document that was.
This document is, yep, this is, and you're gonna see if you were to take a look at plans that were created by lots of different school districts, they're gonna look very similar because they follow all the same components for what we have to have in a personalized reading plan.
Do we have any history at all, or any idea of how many students that we would have currently that fall into this category?
Yes, so we had the fall data that we used to kind of, you know, benchmark where we were headed. One of the things that we found was when you give the first screener and then you give the second diagnostic, the number of students that were flagged by both of those as we've got a concern is actually pretty minimal. So MAP reading fluency, when it went through its process, identified less students as needing support as the diagnostic did. MAP reading fluency is more intense than the first screener, so there's the benefit to that additional layer of diagnostic that we're using. Regardless of if the student is flagged on both or not, they get a reading plan regardless. So if they don't make it through the screener, they're getting a reading plan. The piece of that is we have a lot of control over what this plan looks like. So if we give the diagnostic of MAP reading fluency and it's saying, you know, we don't have any significant concerns, the reason why a student would be flagged in the first place in grades 1, 2, or 3 is a measure called oral reading fluency, and it's measured by words per minute said correct. So you give the student a passage and they read the passage, and basically it's the number of those words that they read correctly in an allotted amount of time. So that's what we're looking for. So with that piece of information, we can say, okay, well, we're not seeing any huge discrepancies in some of the foundational skills that we're looking for. What we're noticing is the student didn't read fast enough for that minute. So there's other things that we can target to help that student with the fluency part. So the intensity of the plan matches the information that we get from the screener and the diagnostic. If the screener and the diagnostic are giving us, I'm gonna call them low-level flags, you're gonna see that represented in this, where we might say, well, the classroom teacher is gonna have 2 small groups on a weekly basis, the student's gonna be a part of it. For 15 minutes, they're gonna work on activities that are related to building up students' fluency, and that's the personalized reading plan. For other students, we might have huge concerns because they may struggle with a lot of the letter sound correspondences, so that, you know, they're missing some of the foundational components of reading. And because of that, we've got to ramp up the level of intensity of this plan. So those 2 things will be created with the reading specialist, the principal, the classroom teacher, so that these plans match what our students need.
I do like that there's 2 different, it's not just one test and here you are, boom, you know. It's nice that there is something that tries to identify why this might be, you know, might have gotten this score and kind of rules you out from, you know, having to be in a program or needing one or not.
Yeah, so that's the one, like, unfortunate piece to how the legislation was written, and they are trying to tweak it. It's just those things move slowly. Regardless of whether or not and this is kind of, you know, in my mind, it doesn't make sense, because if I get a screening at my doctor and then they recommend a diagnostic and I go and get that diagnostic and then the diagnostic finds there's no problem, I'm clear. I don't have anything to worry about. In this world, I take the screener and the screener says there's a problem and the diagnostic says, nope, there's not a problem, it doesn't matter. They're gonna get a reading plan regardless. So that's how the legislation is written, so that's how we will enact it. But what we have control over is the plan. So under that circumstance, if there isn't a big red flag that's there, what looks on here might not be very intense. And part of that would be we're matching the level of instruction that the student needs with what their actual needs are.
And are these audited by anybody, or is this just something that we will have on file for?
We keep this on file. There are certain reporting elements that we need to send to the state. So we have to report out on the number of students who are below the 25th percentile. We do have to report out on the number of students who receive a personalized reading plan. The personalized reading plans are not part of a student's CUME file, so it doesn't travel with them from one district to another. There are some mechanical issues with that because school districts have different things that they're using. So if we write something into our personalized reading plan, such as for the next 10 weeks, they're going to be monitored by MAP reading fluency, and then they transfer to MECWAN. MECWAN might not have MAP reading fluency, so they can't implement the plan as is. As school districts do, we work together. We would give that school district a heads up that we're working on it, let them know about what that plan is and things like that, just so that we can support the student as they're moving from one school district to another, as we would hope another school district would do with us. But the plans aren't. They're, again, less intense than what like an IEP for a student with disabilities might look like. They're a little bit more flexible.
And the hope then is a changing of the legislature would make it so that the diagnostic would rule out having to do.
Yeah, there's a couple of tweaks that they have in there that they would like to make, and that's one of them.
Apologize, I have plans.
Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else? Questions? Comments?
I'm good.
You good? You good?
Oh, I have
All right.
just one question. Is our MAP testing, is it for reading only?
So the MAP reading fluency, just for reading. Our MAP testing, that's for math and for reading.
Okay.
So that we have that internally. Oddly enough, for Act 20, we have to have MAP growth. That's the one that all of our kids have been doing this whole time. It measures one of the strands of Act 20 comprehension, So we have to do that testing too. We had been doing it, but now it's also a piece that we would have to meet all the requirements of Act 20.
Okay, so even though the state's messing with the numbers, we still have our own data.
Correct. Yep.
And we probably didn't have to beat this horse to death as long as we did we?
Well, I guess it's getting information out that,
But we've got our own data on our own students. What do we care what the state says the adjacent school district is doing?
well, just to
know.
the point of people, like we've talked about, as far as somebody looking at the different districts, or people in the community saying, well, what's going on with Germantown? At least we've identified why it looks.
We don't
it
operate in a
does.
silo. We can say we do, that's ignorant.
I didn't say we did.
But I'm just saying that.
We've got our
that's a-
own data. We don't need what the state is.
But we don't,
tweaking.
we don't operate in that silo. So we have to have that conversation. And it's disrespectful not to.
So, just one last question. So, this should give us then kind of an idea of how our curriculum is doing. We'd be able to follow this test. and
Absolutely.
that
So
would
this
give us-
data here is gonna be our best looks at our K-3 kiddos, because forward testing doesn't start until 3rd grade.
Right.
So this is gonna be very useful in saying how well is it performing with our kindergartners and our 1st graders, 2nd graders, because this is, even the math testing is a little higher level skill. This tells us about the foundational skills that are being developed within Wonders, which is going to be very useful for us.
Which,
Right.
to previous conversations, we can intervene early at K1, 2, so that they're on grade level or above by 3rd grade.
Right. Yeah, and look forward to seeing that data, just because starting a new curriculum and see how our kiddos are doing, and look forward to seeing that. Anything else? Any other comments? Well, thank you very much, Jake. A lot of information. Thanks for everybody in there paying attention, and comments and questions and concerns. But with that, we have no unfinished business. Item 6, item 7, no new business. With that, I will take one more motion.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
I have the motion by Tracy and the second by Brian. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Then we are adjourned as of 6:53. Thank you. Drive home safely.